The first thing I saw when I turned onto my driveway was not the mountain I had spent 15 years waking up to every morning. It was a giant wall of steel and glass sitting exactly where my view used to be. My neighbor had built a 2-story guest house on the ridge between our properties, and when I confronted him, he just smiled, took a sip of his coffee, and said, "Honestly, Daniel, this is going to make both of our properties worth more." What he didn't realize was that he wasn't just building a guest house. He was changing something I had worked my entire life to protect. And the worst part was, he truly believed he was doing me a favor. My name is Daniel Harper, and before all of this happened, I was the kind of person who kept life simple. I wasn't wealthy, I wasn't famous, and I never had anyone handing me opportunities. Everything I owned came from years of showing up, working long hours, saving money, and making sacrifices that most people never saw. 15 years before this happened, I bought 6 acres of land on a high ridge outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The property had an old cabin, a rough dirt road, and more trees than neighbors, which was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't looking for a luxury home or someplace to impress people. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere I could hear the wind instead of traffic, somewhere I could sit outside after a long week and remember that life was supposed to be more than meetings and deadlines. The reason I fell in love with that piece of land was the view. From the cedar deck I built with my own hands, I could see the Red Mesa peaks stretching across the valley for miles. Every sunrise looked different. Some mornings the mountains were covered in clouds. Other mornings they looked sharp enough to touch. I know a lot of people might say, "It's just a view," and maybe before I bought that land I would have said the same thing. But when you spend decades working toward one peaceful place of your own, those little things stop being little. That view became my reminder that all those years of hard work meant something. I built that deck myself because hiring someone would have cost more than I could afford at the time. I remember carrying those heavy cedar boards up the slope, one piece at a time, wondering if I was crazy for making things harder than they needed to be. My friends joked that I wasn't building a deck. I was building a wooden airport runway because it took me so long, but I didn't mind. Every scratch on that wood, every mark from my tools, every imperfect corner had a story behind it. Then the Whitlocks moved in next door. Evan and Rachel Whitlock came from Phoenix, and from the first conversation, I could tell they were different from me. They were both involved in real estate, and they had that confident way of speaking that made every idea sound like a guaranteed success. To be fair, when they first arrived, I had no reason to dislike them. They were friendly enough. They waved when they passed by. They complimented the cabin, and they seemed excited about their new property. The first real conversation I had with Evan happened when he walked over one afternoon and leaned against my fence while looking across the valley. "You got one of the best views around here," he said. I smiled and said, "That's exactly why I bought this place." He looked toward the highest point of his land and paused for a moment. Then he said, "We've been thinking about putting a guest house up there. Nothing huge, just something for family when they visit." The second he pointed toward the ridge, I knew exactly where he meant. "You should check the county rules before doing that," I told him. "That area has setback restrictions. The height limits are pretty strict because of the ridgeline." Evan smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone listening. It was the smile of someone waiting for you to finish talking. "I'm sure the county has some flexibility," he replied. I explained that the rules were there for a reason. The ridge was protected because everyone who bought land in that area understood the same thing. You could build, you could improve your property, but you couldn't just put something massive on the highest point and block everyone else's surroundings. Evan nodded like he understood, but I could tell he had already made up his mind. "Don't worry, Daniel," he said. "You won't even notice it." That sentence stayed with me because people usually say things like that when they are looking at the situation from only one side. To Evan, it was just construction. To me, it was someone deciding that the most important part of my home was just empty space waiting for him to use. Still, I tried to be reasonable. I told myself maybe he would keep his word. Maybe the guest house really would be small. Maybe I was worrying about something that would never become a problem. Then I left town for a week to handle work in Denver. When I came back, I knew something was wrong before I even reached my cabin. As I drove around the final curve in the road, I saw a flash of silver reflecting in the sunlight. At first, I thought someone had built a large shed, or maybe a temporary structure. Then I got closer. My stomach dropped. Standing on the ridge was a 2-story steel-framed building, towering above the landscape, sitting directly in the path of the mountain view I had enjoyed for 15 years. Workers in hard hats were unloading materials. carrying drywall, and moving around like the project was almost finished. I parked my truck and just stood there for a moment, trying to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't the small guest house Evan described. This was a statement. This was someone putting his name on the horizon. I walked over and asked the foreman, "Who approved this?" Without hesitation, he answered, "Mr. Whitlock has the permit." A few minutes later, Evan appeared wearing sunglasses, holding a coffee cup, completely relaxed. He looked at the building, then looked back at me. "Pretty impressive, right?" I didn't answer. He laughed slightly and continued, "I mean, this is going to add value to the whole area." I looked past him at the structure blocking the mountains. In that moment, I realized Evan didn't understand what he had taken. He thought I was upset about a building. I knew it was something much bigger. So instead of arguing, instead of giving him the confrontation he probably expected, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Every angle, every detail, every measurement I could document. Because sometimes the biggest mistake people make is assuming silence means weakness. The next morning, I called the county zoning office, and that phone call was the moment everything started to change. The morning after I called the county zoning office, I honestly had no idea what was going to happen. Part of me expected someone to tell me that this was just how things worked, that the permit had already been approved, and that I should accept it and move on. I had lived long enough to know that sometimes the person with the biggest wallet gets heard first. But another part of me kept thinking about that conversation with Evan when he said, "You won't even notice it," because I knew I would notice it. Every single morning, every single sunset, every time I stepped onto my deck and looked toward that ridge. 2 days later, a county inspector named Laura Mitchell arrived at my property. She wasn't dramatic about it. She didn't come in looking for a fight. She was just doing her job, carrying a tablet, a measuring device, and a folder full of documents. Honestly, I respected that. She wasn't there because I complained loudly. She was there because there were rules, and someone needed to check whether those rules had actually been followed. We walked up toward the ridge together, and I watched her study the building from different angles. She looked at the plans, then at the property line, then back at the structure. She didn't say much at first, which somehow made me more nervous. Finally, she pulled out a laser rangefinder and aimed it toward the guest house. The small red light hit the side of the building, and she looked down at her measurements. Then she looked back at me. "Daniel, this structure is not where it should be." I asked her what she meant. She turned the screen toward me. "The setback distance is wrong, and the elevation plan they submitted doesn't match what was actually built." I felt my stomach tighten. "How far off are we talking?" I asked. She looked back toward the ridge, about 36 feet beyond the allowed limit. 36 feet. That number stayed in my head. Because 36 feet might not sound like much when you're talking about a road or a backyard, but when you're talking about a ridgeline and a protected view corridor, 36 feet was the difference between seeing the mountains and seeing a building. Laura spent the next few hours documenting everything. She photographed the structure, checked measurements, reviewed the original permit, and compared the approved plans with what was actually standing there. The more she looked, the clearer it became that Evan had not simply misunderstood a rule. The paperwork itself had problems. The building was larger and positioned differently than what had been represented. I remember standing there watching her work and thinking about how different this would have been if Evan had just talked to me honestly from the beginning. If he had said, "Daniel, we want to build here. Let's figure this out." Maybe we could have found a solution. Maybe I would have compromised. Maybe I would have accepted some changes. But instead, he built first and expected everyone else to adjust afterward. A week after the inspection, I received a letter from Evan's attorney. I knew exactly what it was before I opened it. It was polite, professional, and carefully written. The kind of letter that sounds friendly while making it clear that someone wants you to stop causing problems. The offer was simple. They would provide me with a $500 landscaping credit if I withdrew my complaint. $500. That was their solution. They wanted to cover the inconvenience of losing my mountain view with a little money for plants. I actually laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it showed me they still didn't understand. They thought this was about improving my property. They thought I was upset because my yard needed something. They didn't understand that no amount of flowers, trees, or landscaping could replace the horizon they had blocked. I didn't call Evan. I didn't argue with his lawyer. I simply added that letter to the county file. And that decision changed the entire direction of the situation. The hearing happened a few weeks later. I walked into that room carrying a folder with photos, measurements, and copies of the zoning rules. Evan walked in with his attorney in a completely different level of confidence. He looked like someone who still believed this was going to end with a simple conversation and a handshake. During the hearing, his attorney argued that the guest house improved the neighborhood, that it increased property values, and that removing it would be unreasonable. They talked about investment. They talked about economic benefit. They talked about how much money had already been spent. But every time they brought up those things, I kept thinking the same question. Since when does spending money allow someone to ignore the rules? When it was my turn, I didn't give some emotional speech. I didn't talk about how angry I was. I simply explained why I bought that property and why the regulations existed in the first place. I told them that everyone in that area had the same understanding. We all bought land knowing there were limits. Those limits protected not just one person's view, but the character of the entire ridge. The hearing itself didn't last very long. The county officials reviewed the photographs, the survey data, and the zoning requirements. Then came the decision. The structure was not compliant. Evan had 30 days to bring it into legal height requirements or face daily penalties. I remember looking over at him when the decision was announced. For the first time, there was no confident smile, no casual coffee cup, no talk about property value, just silence. But even then, I didn't feel like I had won, because a part of me understood something important. Nobody really wins when neighbors end up in a legal battle. Something has already been lost by the time things reach that point. The only question is whether you let that loss become permanent or whether you stand up and try to fix it. The next 30 days were uncomfortable. Everyone in the area knew what happened. Some neighbors supported me. Others thought I had taken it too far. A few people told me privately that they understood my side but didn't want to get involved. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. Nobody wants to be caught in the middle of a fight between neighbors. But I also noticed something interesting. The people who criticized me the loudest were usually the ones who had never experienced someone making a decision that directly affected their own home. It is easy to say just let it go when it is not your view disappearing. It is easy to talk about compromise when you are not the one being asked to give up something. Then Demolition Day arrived. I stood beside my fence early that morning and watched the county crew prepare to remove the structure piece by piece. The same building Evan once said would make everyone happier was now coming apart under the same rules he thought didn't apply to him. And as the first section lifted away from the ridge, something happened that I will never forget. For the first time in months, I saw the mountain again. I stood there watching that first piece of the guest house being lifted away, and I expected to feel angry. I expected to feel some kind of satisfaction, like I had finally beaten Evan Whitlock at his own game. But honestly, that wasn't what I felt. What I felt was relief. It was the feeling you get when something heavy that you have been carrying for months finally starts to disappear. Because the truth was, I never wanted his house torn down. I never wanted him to lose money. I never wanted a battle with my neighbor. I just wanted the same thing I had before he arrived. The ability to enjoy my own home the way I always had. The demolition took several days because the county required the structure to be removed carefully and brought back into compliance. Piece by piece, the walls came down. The metal panels were removed, and the shade that had blocked my view slowly disappeared from the ridge. Every morning, I watched a little more of the mountain return. It was almost strange seeing something so familiar feel new again. The first evening after the structure was gone, I sat on my cedar deck with a cup of coffee and watched the sunset. The Red Mesa peaks were exactly where they had always been, but somehow they looked different. Maybe it was because I had spent so long fighting to see them again. Maybe sometimes we don't realize how much something matters until someone tries to take it away. A few weeks later, Evan came over. I wasn't expecting it, especially after everything that happened. For a moment, I thought maybe he was coming over to argue again. But he just stood near the fence and looked toward the mountains. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I really thought you were overreacting." I looked at him and nodded because, honestly, I wasn't surprised. "I know," I said, "because you thought this was about a building." He looked at me. "Wasn't it?" I shook my head. "No, it was about whether the rules mattered. It was about whether one person could decide their plans were more important than everyone else's rights." He didn't say anything after that. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't. Some lessons take longer than one conversation. But that moment made me realize something about conflicts like this. They are rarely just about the thing people are arguing over. The guest house was never really the whole story. The real issue was respect. It was the assumption that because someone had money, experience, or confidence. They could simply push forward and let everyone else deal with the consequences. Over the years, I have heard people say I should have handled it differently. Some neighbors told me I should have just accepted the change. They said views come and go, that people should be able to improve their properties, and that sometimes living in a community means making sacrifices. And I understand that argument. I really do. Nobody wants to live next to someone who turns every disagreement into a war. But there is a difference between being reasonable and allowing someone to ignore the boundaries that protect everyone. A community only works when the rules apply equally. They are not there to stop people from building dreams. They are there to make sure one person's dream does not become someone else's problem. Today, my cabin is still standing on that same ridge. The deck is a little older now. The wood has weathered through countless storms. The cabin has needed repairs, and the mountain winters are still tough. But every morning when I step outside and see the valley stretching out in front of me, I remember why that place mattered so much. It was never just about the view. It was about everything that view represented. The years of work, the sacrifices, the quiet moments I earned after spending most of my life chasing responsibilities. Evan wanted to build something bigger, something impressive, something that would increase value on a piece of paper. But I think he learned something important. Not everything valuable can be measured in dollars. Some things are valuable because they give people a sense of peace. Some things are valuable because they remind you that all the hard work was worth it. And maybe that's the real lesson from this entire situation. Sometimes standing up for yourself is not about creating conflict. Sometimes it is about protecting the things that matter before someone convinces you they don't matter anymore. Now I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought the construction, or would you have accepted the guest house and moved on? Do you think Evan was wrong for building first and dealing with the consequences later? Or do you think neighbors should always find a way to compromise? Leave your thoughts in the comments because these situations are never as simple as they look. And I want to know how you would have handled it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video. Subscribe for more real-life stories about property disputes, unexpected justice, and the moments when ordinary people decide to stand their ground. And if you know someone who has ever dealt with a neighbor conflict, share this story with them. Because sometimes the biggest battles are not fought in courtrooms. They start right over the fence.